wines, Roussanne from Moonlight Vineyard, Texas High Plains, and then the two Hill Country Reds, the Hill Country Cabernet and the Hill Country Petite Sirah. And everybody who's watching this right now has done this before. So you know that while you can have an amazing night and open all three bottles, the intent really is for us to get this content on video so you can access it in the future. If and I think James, Nina, Lucretia, Robert, you guys all have picked up wines already, so you did get the tech sheets. And so worst case scenario, if you did not get the tech sheets, assuming not anybody on this video or in this class, all these QR codes are now the same across all content. And if you haven't scanned it, it basically takes you to a list of ways to interact with Vinovium. There's options for the calendar, options for all of our social media, and obviously options for the wine. And so whether it's on the tech sheet or on the label of the wines, all these QR codes are kind of streamlined to take you to one place. And hopefully that will just make things a little bit easier. All right, so we're gonna start with Roussanne. I'm not sure what you guys are drinking. You know, if you're drinking the Roussanne, that looks like you're drinking Roussanne. Kind of a fun wine. You know, part of these classes is to add some context about what Roussanne is. And then also, as we kind of go down this rabbit hole of content, to kind of tell the story of the vineyards a little bit more. And so I interviewed the owners of this vineyard a couple of weeks back, and they sent some photos, and I'll be sharing that with you as well, so we can, you know, just bring the wine to life in a bigger way. And that's definitely part of the maturing of this wine club is both kind of great content in terms of tech information, but also access to growers and producers that you may not otherwise have access to because of proximity or whatever it may be. Okay, so Roussanne, Texas High Plains, Moonlight Vineyard. This is one of the rare 2020 wines. 2020 was a disaster of a year for grape growing in Texas. It kind of came on the tail end of really three pretty good, or actually great years, and then one average year in terms of 2017 and 2018, and then 2019. So we've had three really awesome years considering. And then we got 2020, and 2020 was, it was highly problematic for three main reasons that all occurred basically 30 days between each other, 3 consecutive months in a row. When we talk about Texas High Plains fruit, we're typically talking about grapes that are harvested kind of mid-August to mid-September, kind of the late ripening varietals like Cab, and even sometimes like other Bordeaux varietals or Cab varietals like Malbec and Cabernet Franc. These grapes can go into late September, early October, but for the most part, when we talk about Texas High Plains, we're talking about a harvest window mid-August to mid-September, so that 30-day period. Well, what ended up happening in basically mid-August, was the High Plains in 2020 had a heat spike of 114 to 115 degrees. And when that happens, basically all the respiration that a plant goes through to create sugar it basically ceases to exist. And so when you have a lack of transpiration in the vine, what ends up happening is the plant can't convert starch into sugar, meaning that you never really get to ripeness. And so you stall out when the only thing you can really hope for is that eventually it'll catch up to itself, the temperatures will cool, and then you can move forward with your growing season. Well, by the time we started to get cooler temperatures in early to mid-September, it also brought a lot of rain. And so on mid-September, we had a break in the heat spike that came with a bunch of rain. And when you talk about heat and then immediately a bunch of moisture, what we really mean is a ton of humidity. And when you talk about humidity in growing grapes, what we're really talking about is mold and mildew issues. Fantastic. So what then ends up happening is the grapes are starting to ripen post-August. Then we have the rain. They swell up with water. They become thinner. And now you have a lack of concentration, a lack of just correct flavors and correct colors. So you hang on a little bit longer. And those that hung on or could have grapes that would hang on, they did. And those that were trying to hedge their bet, they harvested and are producing wines that may not be kind of typical of an average vintage in Texas. And then by the time we got to mid-October, we had a hard freeze. And the issue with that is you can plan a little bit with your forecast, knowing that the hard freeze is coming and you would harvest your grapes. The issue is not so much with the remaining fruit, even though it's probably average or below average quality at that point based off of the two previous conditions. But when you have a hard freeze and the plant does not have the opportunity to actually go into dormancy, meaning it starts to lose all of its leaves and it looks like it's going into a winter slumber, when that happens, you create a situation where the buds that are existing on that living vine or currently alive living vine don't have winter protection. They don't have the means to protect themselves, which means that they freeze out. And then when things freeze, they basically expand. And so you destroy the bud. And the problem with that is that in a given vintage year, while you may get fruit that year, the purpose of that vintage is to lay the foundation for the next vintage. And so when you farm a vineyard, the whole idea is to care for that vine in that year to produce wine the next year. And in reality, when you have buds that die, you basically kill the hope of that vine becoming productive in the next vintage. And so we call that vine death. The other issue with a wine that doesn't have the ability to go into dormancy fully is for young vines. Young vines, most vines are grafted, meaning a root stock that's different than the scion or the plant material, the growing material above ground. And in young vines, if that graft union is not necessarily underground, which it's not really supposed to be, but if it's not, let's say, dirt piled up around it to keep it warm, then that graft union will not hold, and then the plant will die also. And this kind of feeds in a really nice way into the Roussanne, in the sense that the Roussanne is actually an own-rooted Roussanne, and you saw that before when we had the Sangiovese from Philip's Vineyard, an own-rooted Sangiovese, meaning the roots that's in the ground is also the plant that's growing above ground. There is no graft union for situations just like this, for situations where you have young vines or you have bud death that can't deal with winter dormancy, or they, for whatever reason, succumb to disease or whatever it may be. And then you have to either cut the trunk material and let it regrow, or you have to totally rip the rip the plant out from the roots to replant. The reason why own-rooted vines make a lot of sense for places, particularly like the Texas High Plains, is that if you end up having to cut your trunk and regrow, you know that the plant that's going to regrow is actually the same plant that you intended to produce wine out of. And so these are own-rooted Roussanne vines. And so if you haven't tasted the wine, which I'm sure most of you are sipping along, Roussanne for me is, if I were to put Roussanne in a bucket, it would be if I were to compare it to Viognier, a very similar varietal. Viognier and Roussanne are kind of mimic each other, kind of this oily, rich character, kind of tropically fruited, but Roussanne always has more acidity than Viognier. And to kind of put an exclamation point on that, when I say that Roussanne has more acidity, Roussanne is the only white varietal in the Rhone Valley where they make sparkling wine out of. Let me back up. That's not necessarily true. There's two grapes. One is Roussanne, and the other one is a grape called Claret. And both of them are very similar in terms of they are naturally high in acid. They're a little bit leaner, a little bit more tropically fruited in terms of their comparison to Marsanne or Viognier, but kind of on that spectrum of tropical fruit, pitted orchard fruit, both peaches and nectarines. Roussanne can be a little bit more pear-like. But it's an interesting grape because it does have a relatively high amount of natural acidity or total acidity in the wine. The problem with Roussanne is that it ripens at a rate that can exceed an alcohol potential of about 14%. And when you see Roussannes that are above 14%, you know that you're automatically going to get a style of Roussanne that is much fatter, rounder, more Chardonnay in style. And I think this is where Roussanne starts to lose quality, is when you get Roussanne above 14%. Unlike Viognier, you can have Viogniers 14.5%, 15%, and be okay with that because there's enough richness, enough broadness in the wine to kind of match that alcohol. Roussanne, once you get above 14%, starts to behave in a very strange way. That being said, this is a very boozy wine. This is a 15% alcohol wine. And the question is why is it different? How is it able to hide that alcohol in a more petite package, if you will, compared to some Viogniers that you may have had or other Roussannes you may have had? And the answer lies in, if you're looking at your tech sheet here, there's a line that talks about residual sugar, pH, and total acidity. The pH is high for a white wine. You know, the average pH for a red wine, for example, is right around 3.6, 3.65. And the higher you go up in pH, the softer the wine feels across the palate, the more weighty, the richer, the more kind of gummy, glycerol kind of texture that the wine will take on. What's average for, like, let's say Sauvignon Blanc, Pinot Grigio, unoaked Chardonnays, you're talking about pHs closer to 3.3, 3.4. So we are definitely kind of a white wine, or excuse me, white wine almost disguised as a red wine situation. These are fuller bodied white wines for sure. But the thing that makes this wine balance with the alcohol is the total acidity. When we talk about total acidity, we have to, it's different than pH. pH is basically, not to be so technical here, pH is basically hydrogen that's bound to other molecules. And so it's dissolved in solution. Total acidity can be a range of other types of acids, which contribute to the total acidity of a wine. And the total acidity here is pretty good. The lower you go, the more acidity you're going to perceive. And so typically for, let's say for a red wine, you're talking about anywhere between 7 and 8. This is on a scale of 10. And for a lighter bodied, like let's say dry Rieslings or something like that, or even Gruner Veltliners, you're talking about total acidities in the mid 5s. And so we're not low in acid to kind of keep this alcohol in check. And also the wine's overall fruitiness, flavor profile is all pretty well integrated and makes this wine a little bit more balanced. Let's see. So we're working with a new winemaker for this wine. This is Michael Barton at Hilmy. We'll eventually have Michael here on a session. Alan is joining us. Let me bring in Alan. And so at some point we'll bring in Michael. We'll have that conversation. If you haven't had an opportunity to go and taste with Michael at Hilmy, it's definitely worth your time. Things have changed there in terms of kind of the winemaking team. Michael comes from Llano Estacado and the Texas High Plains and has made wines for a while, and he brings a lot of expertise to that team. And so it's exciting to see him there and have him kind of in our wheel of relationships to do some things with. In terms of other things pertaining to this wine, you can kind of read the tasting note. I think the thing that really stands out is that Roussanne as a varietal tends to be one of these grapes that you could put some oak into it. And I say that with a slight hesitation in that Roussanne has the ability to oxidize very quickly. And so I'm not a fan of oaked age Roussannes because it creates a richer style that I'm not necessarily a fan of. And so working with Michael to produce a stainless steel version of Roussanne, no secondary fermentation, meaning no malolactic fermentation, and then no oak aging. The wine is basically meant to be fresh and clean. Even though it is a cheap date wine in terms of its alcohol content, it doesn't drink like a 15% alcohol by volume. Look at that. By volume, there you go. So let's see, some other things to talk about. Moonlight Vineyard. So the owners here are Peggy and George Seeley. And one of the first questions I asked Peggy when I interviewed her was, why did she call it Moonlight Vineyard? And she basically said, well, I hate working in the sun and I only want to be out at night. And so I want to be in the vineyard under the moon. And so That's why it's called Moonlight Vineyard. And it's an interesting place in the sense that it's not a very big vineyard. Let's see. It's about 10 acres in total, planted in 2010. They have 1 acre of Cinsault, 3.5 acres of Roussanne, and then the remaining acreage planted to Mourvedre. And you can see some of their wines. They got wines from their grapes and wines from William Chris, from Hilmy, from Lewis, from Signor, and now Vinovium. And elevation, 3,200 feet above sea level. Nothing, out of the ordinary there, what you would expect from the high plains. Grapes harvested in late September, own rooted. And I wanted to show some pictures of their vineyard, mainly because it's kind of different compared to other high plains vineyards. Let's see, where did it go? You can definitely see sandy clay loam. It's basically red soils. What they tried to do in their vineyard is they planted trees. They planted trees on the boundary of their property. One, because there are no trees in the Texas High Plains, and two, they wanted a way to kind of mitigate the wind in the region, and so at least coming across their vineyard. And so their trees, according to them, help basically calm the intensity of the winds blowing through their vineyard. And you could say that could be sometimes an issue, particularly when it rains, because wind helps dry out vineyards, so reduce your mold and mildew pressures. But they basically say that wind, because it's being blocked, produces a vineyard site that ripens slightly earlier, and so their grapes are able to stay a little bit fresher. I mean, I guess I can appreciate that, but I don't know if that's necessarily true. So that's an interesting photo. I have a couple of more. Yeah, so it's just one of the few places in the High Plains that they actually planted trees. And what they ended up doing is the family basically moved to the Texas High Plains over 38 years ago. And they come from a ranching background in Colorado. And they had Andy Timmons consult with them on the vineyards in 2006, and then started planting in 2010. But they kind of do it. They're both retired. They kind of do it as a way to kind of just have something to do. And the wines are really good. The Roussanne is really pretty. I'm very happy with the Roussanne. But kind of a pretty vineyard shot. Basically you see soils of the Texas High Plains, red dirt. And then to kind of wrap up Roussanne, God bless wine folly. I mean, these are all things that we've had kind of talked about before. Citrus notes, apricot, peachy notes. You get a little bit of honeycomb. You get like these kind of chamomile, Earl Grey flavors of tea-like, and brioche. Brioche is one of these characteristics that you really get from oak aging, whether it be from the oxidation of oak aging or the richness that oak aging brings, or even batonnage, meaning wine aging on lees. You can kind of get these brioche characters. This wine, I don't think really has any brioche characters. And in terms of your tasting profile, you can kind of see dry, medium bodied. In terms of tannin level, it's moderate, medium acidity. I would say that Texas Roussanne compared to, let's say, California Roussanne, I don't know. It's very hard to pull them apart. Even French Roussanne. French Roussanne tends to be a little bit richer, riper, but maybe I'm saying that because I intentionally wanted this wine to be a little bit leaner and brighter, even though the alcohol content's pretty high. And so it's kind of just very classic Roussanne. In terms of the vineyard, kind of to wrap up here, Roussanne is basically a varietal that, in terms of its idealness for Texas, is, I think, for a lot of people better than Viognier, in the sense that it has a little bit better acidity. It can produce a little bit of a leaner wine, a little bit more refreshing of a wine. But at the same time, it's a grape that tends to bud after Viognier. And so for early spring frost, it tends to do better in that regard. And then in the high plains, compared to Viognier, it needs to ripen a little bit longer. So it tends to have a little bit of a longer growing season, but that just also depends on your ultimate style of wine you're trying to make. All right, any questions about the Roussanne? It's really pretty. So that'll be on tap. I think it'll be on tap starting this week. There's a good dozen kegs or so. Let's see what the chat.
Daniel.
Situation. Yeah.
What should we eat with it?
Okay, I would say lobster with a butter sauce. Any sweet crab meat would be really, really great. Liver is delicious. If you're into liver patés, shellfish, of really kind of cooked shellfish, crab and lobster and crawfish would be really pretty tasty too. Trying to think, there's a very famous salad that has bacon, and a poached egg. So a salad from Lyon called the Lyonnaise salad is basically a poached egg with bacon crumbles and kind of a very rich, kind of savory kind of salad. Something like that would go really well. Anything with a poached egg on a brioche bun, I think would be really pretty. What do you think would go with it?
I was thinking spicy because I get a sweetness, but
yeah, I mean,
not as much as like a Riesling, but I could almost do something spicy.
Yeah, I'm curious how the alcohol content would interfere with spice. I think that's an interesting exercise. We'll have to do that one day when we do Thai food, just to kind of see how it plays out with spice. I think there's enough acidity there to keep it in question. I'm curious. I think it would be an interesting pairing, particularly if you do like a sweet and spicy sauce versus just like straight pepper or like a vinegar based spice, like chicken wings or something like that. I don't think that would be necessarily appealing. All right, you guys. So we're going to segue into our little conversation with Alan. And let me kind of just introduce Alan and then the two wines that we have in front of us. If you are drinking the Cab or the Petite Sirah, congratulations. The wines are super delicious. Okay, so Alan, if you want to unmute yourself and show everyone your beautiful face. Assuming that's what you were wanting to do, I don't know. I mean, you could just talk if you want to talk.
It's pretty scary.
There you go. What a handsome gentleman you are.
Woohoo!
So Alan and I's relationship kind of goes back to, when did we do that tasting? I think 2010, the Texas versus the World tasting, Tannat tasting at the...
Oh, long time. Yeah, 10 or 11.
10 or 11. And so one of the interesting, I guess, trivia things, Alan was the first person to plant Tannat in the Texas Hill Country. And so I give him credit before anybody else, but he doesn't, no one else knows about it. So there's that. And we'll definitely talk about the Old Estate Vineyard and kind of his current path in terms of where he's located. But Alan has been one of these guys that started out as a grower, and he'll tell his story, and then became a winemaker. And then we kind of met through the Texas versus the World series that we had going back in 2010, which a lot of you have already participated in. The very first Texas versus the World was at Westcave Cellars. We did Tannat in the middle of the night, and then had to all drive back to Austin off of Hamilton Pool Road. And that, if you ever been to the old Westcave property, you know what kind of drive that is, much less after you've been drinking 20 wines and then having to drive. But so Alan has made both the Woodrose Cab and the old Westcave estate vineyard for the Petite Sirah. And as I kind of gather my notes, Alan, if you wouldn't just kind of introduce yourself, tell people kind of a little bit story about your background and where the winery was and where it is today. And that by that time you get through all that, we can talk about some of these wines.
Okay, I'll try not to go into too much detail. got interested in wine in the early 90s, planted a little hobby vineyard in mid 90s, got serious and bought some acreage, late 90s, planted Cabernet Sauvignon on Hamilton Pool Road in 1999. So one of the oldest cab vineyards in Texas still today. It's still there. And expanded that vineyard to 9 acres. We had 9 different varietals. We planted Tannat in 2008. We planted Tempranillo, it never really worked. So we pulled it up and planted Petite Sirah, which I'm a big fan of tonight. And I think that's the wine on the menu. And then we expanded again in 2012 and planted Malbec and Syrah and a bigger block of Vermentino. We also had Vineyard there. And then in 2019, we sold that property and we still lease back those 9 acres of vineyard. 2010, we applied for the TABC license, and we never really intended to be a winery. I never intended to be a winemaker, but Seth Martin kind of kept giving me buckets of grapes saying, why don't you make some wine out of this and see what you can do? And a couple other people, Scott Collier and a few others, were involved in getting me interested in making wine. So we said, you know, we can do this. We'll just jump off the cliff. And yeah, that's exactly what happens when you start a winery. So anyways, we had 9 acres of grapes and 9 different varietals. And Petite Sirah has become one of my big favorites. Cabernet has always been a big favorite. Merlot is my all-time favorite wine. And we source grapes, Merlot grapes, from one vineyard since 2011. We've been very successful with this one vineyard, Tony Hendricks family vineyard, in it's just south of Lubbock. I guess his address is Ropesville, but he's actually in Lubbock. So it's north of Brownfield. But Merlot, Cab, and the Bordeaux style in general, Petite Sirah, Malbec, Petit Verdot, those are all wines that I just really, really enjoy. We make a lot of other wines. We do Sangiovese, we do a lot of Italian varietals for other people. Vermentino, Pinot Grigio, Montepulciano. Again, most of those are custom wines for other people. But the wines in our tasting room are primarily Tannat, Cab Sauv, Petite Sirah. We do a blend, an Alamar blend, which is Bordeaux, Merlot, Cab Sauv, Cab Franc. We do Cab Franc varietal, which not too many people do. We do a Cab Franc rosé, which nobody does. And it's pretty interesting. It's never a rock star, as Daniel would say, but it's a nice rosé wine.
It's great as you don't move it.
So anyway, so what the wines on the menu tonight are, so we still farm the 9 acres in Hamilton Pool Road at the old Westcave cellars. Last year we sold the property and moved to High. We just needed to get more traffic to the winery. And so we're now located just off Sandy Road, about a half mile off of 290 on Ranch Road 1320. And we have our full selection of wines. We have at least 20 wines on the menu at any given time. And there's always more that aren't on the menu. So feel free to come in and ask for, do you have any other wines? Because there's always something that's not on the menu that you have to ask for. And it may be recently bottled, or it may be leftovers, that we're down to the last few cases and it's not on the menu. But there's usually something good behind the counter that's not listed on the menu. And it's usually pretty good. So anyways, the Woodrose Cab is a small vineyard that's across the street from the Bella Vista Ranch, which is an olive oil company. And the Bella Vista Ranch grows Sangiovese and Cab Franc. So our Cab Franc and Sangiovese comes from that place. And then right across the street is Woodrose Cab. It's a very young vineyard. And this particular batch of wine, it was a pretty small batch, about 150 or 160 gallons. And that's why we said we don't really want to bottle it and label it yet. It's just not enough quantity because of the young vineyard. So we've sold it to Vinovium, and it's a really nice wine. And it is a big, bold Texas Cabernet. It's a limestone chalky soil, so it is going to be a classic Texas hill country Cabernet. Very dry, very chalky, and a little bit high alcohol. I think it's over 14, if I remember, Daniel. We keep the pH pretty low. We keep it down around 3.45 or 3.50, so it's going to be crisp. It's going to hold up. But this is a bold wine. Daniel has it on tap. We had 1 or 2 kegs we kept, and we had it on tap. And to be honest with you, some of our club members thought it was too heavy and too big compared to some of the other Cabernets. So it has a little bit of that grip factor. You know, it'll curl your teeth in a certain way. It's not necessarily as big as a big Cabernet from Napa Valley, but it has beautiful color and tannins, and the fruit just pops out. Again, these are fairly young vines. The 2018 within the third harvest, third harvest, are probably 5th year vines on this vineyard. And, you know, it was only half an acre of grapes, so we didn't get many grapes, enough to either blend or make a straight varietal out of it. But this vineyard is very, very promising for me, and we're keeping very close tabs on it. The other half acre in that vineyard was planted to Sirah. That has been pulled up 2 years ago when we replanted to Cab. So this year we will have the first harvest out of that second half acre of Cabernet. So it will be 1 full acre of Cabernet, and it's hill country, and it's limestone calcareous soil with that, you know, limestone rocks everywhere, and it's not very deep. The vines struggle. And we continue to look at the nutrient levels in the vines, and we get yellow leaves and red leaves and all different kinds of typical hill country problems with growing grapes, especially these kind of grapes. I don't know how much detail to go in, but the whole vineyard is Clone 7 and Rootstock 110R, which Clone 7 is a notorious Bordeaux clone, and it's long stringy clusters with little tiny berries, and we call it BBs on barbed wire because the berries are very small. There's not a lot of juice produced in a given cluster. We do produce a lot of clusters, but again, it's the juice level and is just not there. But the berry size gives it this great color, and the disease pressure, because it's a loose cluster, it's not a really tightly closed cluster like Syrah or Sangiovese. We don't have big issues with disease on this Clone 7. It's also, Clone 7 is also primarily what we had at Westcave, so that's why we did it again. So anyways, it's a nice wine. This is a wine, I would say it needs at least a year or more before you really start drinking it. And if you're getting it in a growler, I don't know how to do that. But decant it and swirl it a lot. And when it opens up, the fruit comes out, and it's really a nice little wine.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So let me add some color to the story. He said that it's a young vineyard, fifth year, third leaf or third harvest in terms of making wine. I kind of made some notes about the last couple of years. There was no 2019 vintage was that a hail issue, or what was the issue in 2019?
You broke up there. Is it 2019?
Yeah.
So
there was no vintage in 2019.
Well, so actually there was. 2019 we had a really good vintage in Westcave cellars, and we also sourced cab from High Plains, Doug Thomas Vineyard, which you tasted also. It's pretty-
Woodrose cab. Yeah.
So the Woodrow that year, it was less than 1 ton, and we actually sold the grapes to Southold. So
Oh,
they
okay.
made wine out of it, and they probably still have some if you want to go try their version of this wine of this grape from the same vineyard.
Okay, fantastic. And then
I'm not
2020,
100% sure what they did.
yeah, and then 2020, my note says there were 60 gallons total.
Yeah, it's in a barrel. I have 1 barrel.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more. The reason why this cab we really fell in love with, and this goes all the way back to the Social Distance Tempranillo blend. This is the same cab that's in the Social Distance Tempranillo blend, which is 20% of this Hill Country Woodrose Cabernet. And I think from a tasting profile, while Alan had mentioned that this is a clone that was modeled off of Cabernet grape from Bordeaux. The wine is more earthy, more rustic, more kind of, I guess, more in the world of a kind of a savory, rustic, old world style varietal than it is what you would expect from another type of clone, or what you would think of as a kind of a Napa Valley style of Cabernet. And when you think about what Social Distance is, Tempranillo, 60% Tempranillo, 20 Cab, 20 Merlot. This is a wine that just fits really well with that profile. And so while it's a very big wine in terms of its tannin profile, we really loved it because of its earthy flavor and aromatic profile, which I think complements the Tempranillo in a really tremendous way. There's a couple of other things I think that sets Alan apart as a winemaker than what you may see from other wineries. And I think that it lends itself to these wines that have incredible aromatics. And both of these wines are very complex aromatically as young wines. And I think that is part due to how Alan actually produces wines. And he has a kind of a model or a pattern that you see across both the Cab and the Petite. And what that model is basically open top fermentation in a harvest bin. And a harvest bin, Alan, what's the volume of a harvest bin?
Sure. Usually, if it's hand harvested, it's 900 to 1,000 pounds. Machine harvest could be 12 to 1,300 pounds and more juice. But all of this that we're talking about is hand harvested.
Right. Okay. And so he's doing this in small lots, comparatively so, not in large tank. So open top fermentation. They're all whole berry crushed. So you're getting some of the bitter tannin character from seeds and from stems. And then I think what's really interesting is that while he's fermenting in these harvest bins, he's also adding oak chips or an oak alternative. And I think, Alan, if you could explain that here in a minute in terms of why you do that. And then I think the other thing that kind of contributes to the aromatic profile of Alan's wines is that he prefers to make wines that have a pretty long fermentation compared to other Texas wines that you find. Sometimes it's logistics and you make things happen as they go, but Alan is fermenting these wines kind of in the mid 70s. They're taking 3 to 4 weeks to ferment dry. And when you do that, I think you create risk in the sense that your grapes are a little bit more exposed. You have to make sure that the caps don't dry out. But at the same time, if you're able to make your fermentation go longer, which I think is very much an old school way of doing things, an old world mentality of making wine, is that you create a lot more complexity aromatically across the wine. The opposite of that is a quick hot fermentation, and hot fermentations also have their own risks. Basically, if you get too hot, you could kill your yeast and stop your fermentation, and then you get a stuck fermentation, and that lends to other problems. But also with a hot, fast fermentation, you tend to get more fruity characters, a little bit more intensely fruited characters versus kind of this nuance of fruit. And I really appreciate the finesse that Alan's wines have, because it lends themselves to use aroma as a building block for a blend. And I think that's really where the Cab shines in the Social Distance Tempranillo blend. Obviously, the wine has really great tannin and fruitiness, but the fruit in the Social Distance blend kind of gets lost behind the Tempranillo fruit. And we really needed it to bring some kind of old world earth, great acidity, and just really pretty aromatics to the wine. So Alan, if you wouldn't mind, kind of talk about your philosophy in terms of fermenting with oak chips and kind of what that really lends to the wine as a final product.
So our general process for red wines, especially old world red wines, Cabernet, Merlot, Petite, Sirah, Malbec, most of them are hand harvested in the harvest bins. We'll crush and destem and put them just right back in a harvest bin, depending on the batch size, of course. And then they will ferment in those bins in a temperature controlled room. And that room might be at 60 degrees, which is difficult to do in August. But we also do all of our corrections, acid corrections, pH corrections, right on the crush pad. So we're going into fermentation with any additions or changes we want to that wine right up front, so that once the yeast, once we inoculate, and we don't always inoculate, we have done some natural fermentations, but once the yeast goes in, then everything that gets added becomes well integrated during the fermentation process. And so we will add tartaric. We do minimal amount of sulfite. We do French oak toasted chips in fermentation. We do add tannins for color, to extract more color and flavor. We usually pick a yeast, depending on the batch size. We might do 2 different yeasts, and either in one batch or maybe in two different batches, and then blend them back together, targeting flavor profile and mouthfeel or things like that. And then we do a slow fermentation. We punch down twice a day. And one of the things we do not do, I know a lot of people do, is we do not press directly to barrels. And we do not press until fermentation is complete, all the skins have settled. So that some people call that extended maceration. Then there's other people that do 6-week extended maceration, which we do not. But typically it's 3 to 4 weeks before we'll press a red wine off of the skins. So we do get the good color, and it's usually a slower fermentation. And it'll go 3 or 4 weeks, and wait till we get all the color we want, and we're stirring it up twice a day, at least twice a day. And then when we press, we'll press it into a stainless tank and let it settle. And again, a lot of people don't do that because time constraints or whatever. We'll press to a stainless tank, leave it settle for 4 to 7 days a week, typically, and then put it in a barrel. So what goes into a barrel is not a wine that has a lot of skins or proteins or other sediments. It's pretty much a fresh wine. It's not clear, of course, but it goes into a barrel, and when we put it in a barrel, it's in that barrel. We do not rack barrels every 6 months or whatever. So it's in that barrel for the life of the wine, and that could be 18 or 24. In this case, it's probably closer to 30 months because of the COVID and our move. So this wine, this particular Cabernet wine, was in a punch-in, which is a large format barrel, and it was probably there 30 months. So that's a long time for red wine, but in a large barrel, that's a very appropriate time frame. It's not unusual. Yeah. And when the wine comes out, we do not make any adjustments or changes after that. I mean, we'll add sulfites, and of course we do filtering, but we do not do acid corrections or pH adjustments or anything after that point. So what comes out of fermentation is what you get, basically, and then it goes into a barrel, and then that marriage between the oak and the wine takes place.
Yeah, I think
so that's pretty much it.
Alan, I find it interesting. If one of the conversations 5+ years ago in the Texas wine industry was all of our wines seemed to be lack of color, lack of concentration, all of the things. And then we start to see these new techniques co-fermenting with the skins of white grapes, and oak fermenting or fermenting with oak, because tannins from skins and from oak help fix color, which I find, I don't know the science of that. It seems to be a very fascinating thing that you start to see more and more of this. But I think the days are gone when we talk about Texas wines having shit color, excuse my language, but it's kind of a thing of the past in a way. And now we're getting these wines colors that you would expect from the grapes that we're growing. And I think that's just a neat thing, a neat evolution of the Texas wine industry, Okay, so let's kind of move on to the Petite Sirah. Actually, before we wrap up the cab, there is a couple of things. I'm going to pull up the Wine Folly cab example, what they think a tasting note for cab should be. I'm going to make a huge generalization, and I think it definitely plays out in the Petite Sirah that we're about to taste. I think when you take a grape in Texas, compare it to that same grape outside of Europe, but from another New World region, I think you get similar fruit character. I think the thing that really makes Texas stand out is the finesse of that fruit. We have a lot more going on in terms of both how fruit and earth or minerality and acidity kind of play out. Whereas other regions, they're a little bit more fruited, or they're a little bit more earthy. I think Texas is this beautiful hybrid of restraint, both in terms of fruit and overall structure, that makes the wines a little bit more elegant, a little bit more finesse. And I think they're really pretty, particularly with the Petite Sirah. I think if you give this cab to a Napa Valley cab drinker, they're gonna question where's the intensity of body, where's the intensity of alcohol and structure for this wine. But in reality, for a Texas Cabernet, and I don't say that as it has its exception, I think that this Cabernet is a world-class Cabernet in the sense that it is both varietally correct. It is not underripe, meaning you're not getting any of these kind of green or underripe flavors or aromas. You're getting complexity across the smell of the wine. And then on the taste, it's the tannin are concentrated. They're fine tannins. They're not kind of like bulky tannins in the sense that they kind of hit your palate in many different ways. It's just a very elegant, fine structure across the wine, and the wine drinks youthful, meaning there's a lot of freshness in the wine. So in terms of that cherry fruited flavor that you're tasting, it's definitely ripe, but not dried out or flabby or kind of just a lazy fruit character. It's very much noticeable. The tannins are very much noticeable. The wine is definitely showing its youth. And for a 2018 wine that has the potential to age for several years, I think that says a lot for Texas cab in general, and particularly for Hill Country cab. I mean, again, when we talk about Hill Country harvest, we're talking about early to mid-August. And this wine harvested August 16 to 18. And for a varietal that needs a long growing season, and when you talk about long growing season, up to the early to mid-October, and we're getting full character of a grape that is meant to have that long of a growing season that's harvested in mid-August, I think it says something about both the versatility of the grape in the Hill Country, but also kind of the expectations and what we expect a grape to do in a particular place may not always be true. And we have to open up our minds. And when we think of Texas cab, it's not always mediocre. It can sometimes be awesome and excellent and really outstanding. So I think that's one of them. Wine Folly says cherry fruit, blue fruit. This looks like clove and cinnamon and graphite. I don't think we necessarily have those graphite characters in the Texas cab. It's a little bit more dusty red fruit, but similar. I mean, dryness is, you expect it to be dry. It's not as full bodied as Wine Folly suggests it should be. It's got a little bit more acid than Wine Folly suggests it should, and the alcohol is kind of right on point. So meaning we're getting the ripeness as we expect it to be. Okay, So let's go to Petite Sirah. So Alan, I guess start with the saga of planting Petite Sirah on the old estate.
In 2006, we wanted to expand, and so we planted Tempranillo and Viognier, and the Viognier did well. And 2 years later, the Tempranillo was like this big, and so we pulled it up and tried another rootstock and another clone. And 2010, the Tempranillo was this big and not doing well. And we decided, and we had kind of done a lot of research on Tempranillo, was really into Tempranillo wine at the time, and basically said, this isn't going to work at this site. And we had talked with good friends and sold grapes to Seth Martin at Barissos, and he said, try Petite Sirah. So 2010, we planted Petite Sirah, and for whatever reason, that particular location, the Petite Sirah has been magnificent. And we planted 1 acre, 750 vines, and it has great color. It's a manageable vine. When I say that, it's like to not Cabernet or not manageable vines, they take a lot of attention. It's a very well-behaved vine from a growing standpoint, but it also produces a very consistent crop. And we can push it to 24, 25 bricks and get a higher alcohol, but we've really learned, picking it at 24, 23 and a half and getting a 13.5, 13.2% alcohol is a whole lot better from the fruitiness and the flavor. But the color that comes out of the grapes and this particular location is, to me, it's just amazing. And we use it in blending, but we also do a varietal, which very few people do, a Petite Sirah varietal. And it is pretty much a full-bodied wine. It's got good alcohol. The aging process is good. We have wines going back to 2012 in the library, and they're still holding up really well. The color, like I said, the color is great. The tannin structure is not overpowering. Historically, Petite Sirah is called Durif in France. You don't ever get a Petite Sirah from France. And it's a blending wine. California called it Petite Sirah. And it's just been a really nice wine. And it's great drinking by itself or blending it with other wines as well.
I was saying, I don't know if Alan, if you have the same wine for you, or if the barrel regiment was slightly different for us compared to what you have. But one of the things I love about this wine is, while it's not over the top oaked, I mean, there is some oak character, but it's really kind of very subtle. The fruit is the star here. I mean, it's incredible fruit, very elegant. I think that fruitiness that people want, plus the body, plus the tannin, are kind of all really perfectly matched in this wine. And I guess for me, Petite Sirah is one of these grapes in Texas that I think has a real place in the sense that a lot of producers produce Petite Sirah. They all tend to give great color, great finesse. I don't think I've had a bad Petite Sirah in Texas, really, for the most part. I love this Petite Sirah just because, one, of its story and you and kind of our involvement and how well it drinks, and it's just quite nice. And so some of the other notes that I have in terms of how the wine was produced, similar to the Cab, a 3 to 4 week fermentation, grapes harvested. Where's that note? You may know before I find it, Alan.
I'm sure it's mid-August, like 8th or 10th or somewhere around there.
Yeah, there we go. August 8th. And then barrel fermented on open top fermenters, 3 to 4 week fermentation, 65 to 70 degree fermentation, fermented with oak chips, and then aged. This one was aged in second use for 26 months, your Baron barrel. So those are 225 liter barrels. And
that's correct.
And, to tell a little story, anytime you go into Alan's winery and you ever do a barrel tasting, ask for the Barone barrels. Yeah, they're just, I don't know what it is about that barrel that is just delicious.
Yeah, so a couple things on this wine. Petite Sirah is one of the estate wines that we do. When we Vineyard comes in usually around July 28th or 30th. And we hold back skins. We put them in the plastic bags and put them in a freezer. And the estate red wines, Petite Sirah, Tannat, Cab Sauv, we put Viognier skins in the fermentation, and the white skins. This is a standard practice in Rhone Valley, and I've other winemakers that beg me for the Viognier skins that we have, but it helps to stabilize the color and really bring out that just beautiful dark color. So the Petite certainly got the Viognier skins. And then the second thing, as Daniel was mentioning, is probably 3/4 of the estate wines go into Barone barrels, which we came across in 2015. And the two barrels that this Petite Sirah came from are 225-liter Barone Colte. It's a proprietary blend toasting process that they use. So it's super tight grain, 36-month aged oak. So these are pretty expensive barrels. And they focus on preserving the fruit and their term is the fatness of the wine. These are French oak barrels made in France. And they only make about 250 of these barrels a year. I don't know how we got into it, but we get an allocation of 4 of those every year. The rest of the Petite Sirah, to answer Daniel's question, that year was in other Barone barrels, but it was in a punch-in, a 500-liter, which does not have the same toasting or grain structure of that wood, but it's close. It's close. So Vinovium got the premier Petite Sirah from the 2018. And it was 2 barrels, so it was about 120 gallons.
Yeah.
Which, it's a pretty small amount technically.
Yeah.
But it's a beautiful wine, a beautiful color. We are bottling about the same amount, 120 gallons, 50 cases. And the rest, there wasn't a whole lot left, but it's going into 2 other blends. We don't do very many red wine blends, but the Petite will be in 2 other blends that we have, Alamar and Vineyard, this year. But again, Petite adds color, it adds backbone and structure. It can be overpowering if it's in a blend. And we had a previous blend where it did kind of overpower the Malbec, and then literally 2 years into the bottle, the Petite Sirah kind of backs off and gives way to the other wines. So it is a powerful grape, but it ages well, and we've not had any issues with aging this wine. And we have library wines back to 2012, and they're all holding up really well. So it's just a beautiful wine, and it's not Cabernet and it's not Merlot. So it's interesting. You have to like it. You have to grab onto it. It's like blueberries, and it's not cassis and blackberries or dried fruit. It's a little bit different, but it is a very, very interesting wine.
Yeah, it's really quite pretty. And I put up the Wine Folly description, blue fruited, black pepper, maybe some black tea character, definitely kind of dark fruited on the spectrum. Really, really pretty. So to add some a little bit more context, just for trivia's sake, not that this is going to be on trivia, I've kind of groomed our wine club members, Alan, to every time we do a virtual class, they know that I'm going to pull questions from the virtual class to ask in the third Friday trivia. So I have to be careful about saying for trivia or whatever. Maybe this is a trivia question. I don't know. We'll see. So a couple of other things in terms of kind of how it behaves in the vineyard. It basically buds after Malbec and after Syrah, but before Cab. And the same thing in terms of its ripening. It tends to ripen after Malbec and after Syrah, but before Cab. And so and its personality in the vineyard seems to be like, it's a laissez-faire, easy go, easy come kind of varietal. It's easy to farm. It harvests at an appropriate time. You don't have to worry about getting into late season where you have more issues with rain. You tend to not have so much issues with frost, and maybe your experience in the hill country is slightly different with that, Alan. And then I guess to kind of summarize or wrap up, what's the future of the old estate vineyard in terms of Petite Sirah? And if you're not able to get access to that fruit in the future, are you going to continue with Petite Sirah?
Yeah, so to your point about the vineyard, it is as I said earlier, in people don't understand it if you're a grower, unless you're a grower, but it's a well-behaved vine. So it doesn't go to 27 or 28 bricks, no matter how long you let it hang. But you can get more color. And the vines are not unmanageable and going gangly and having to trim and prune them continuously like Tannat or Cab. So it is a nice, well-behaved, it does not overcrop. So it is a good grape to grow. So that in mind, at our new location next year, we do plan to plant vines. And, Petite Sirah is top of the list, probably ahead of Cab and Tannat. I don't know that we'll plant Cab. It's a very difficult vine to grow in the hill country. Tannat is certainly on the list, but Petite Sirah is probably the top priority, just because of the consistency, and it's easier to grow than other wines. So the old vineyard, I think we will be able to get grapes from there for at least a couple more years, till they decide if they're going to do a winery or what they want to be when they grow up and learn about farming. And farming grapes in the hill country is pretty tough, but they'll figure it out. But we have plenty of Petite Sirah, and even like 19 and 20, we came up short on Cab Sauv and Tannat, but we still got Petite Sirah yields, which is another thing. It's like it just continues to come through, even in the most difficult years of cold and freeze and frost. So we do have Petite Sirah for every year up through 20. We did get some last year, and again, it's enough. 50 cases, and our goal primarily is to serve our club members with Petite Sirah and keep that library going.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's exciting to know, Alan, that we have more Petite Sirah in our future, and it's one of the grapes that we have talked about. I told you a little bit about our wild hair to plant a vineyard here at this property.
Yeah.
Petite Sirah is definitely one of the grapes that is in the top red grape. Just based off of what I've seen from you and what others have done, and it just seems to be a grape that consistently performs, and it's delicious. It's just simply a really delicious wine. So, all right, Alan, I really appreciate you. You've kind of been one of these guys to me personally that has not only been a friend, but a mentor on many levels in terms of sharing knowledge and access to information and willingness to kind of get me involved. And I really appreciate our relationship and the wines that you make. And I'm excited for the new Westcave up the road. I think you guys are going to be doing great things. And if you haven't been to Westcave Cellars, you guys are what Wednesday through Sunday, or Monday through
Thursday through Monday. Yeah.
Thursday through Monday. And
Yep.
Are you appointment only?
Nope. We prefer appointments. If you don't have an appointment, you can actually pick the table you want.
Yeah.
And we also have beer. If you're,
yeah, that's right.
If you have that one person in your group that wants a beer instead of wine, then don't hesitate to come. We don't have a lot of beer and we don't focus on that, but we do serve 100% Texas beer.
Wow. What is 100% Texas beer?
The guy that brews the beer for us grows his own hops, and we use barley from Mason, and he has spring water. Like we're just releasing a pecan porter, And the pecans are from his ranch, and he toasts them and roasts them and does the whole barrel fermentation. We have a 1 barrel fermenter and a 1 barrel bright tank, and we produce the beer right there on site. So it's very small quantities, like five small kegs per month. But we typically have 3 or 4 beers on tap at any given time.
That's awesome. Awesome. And Alan, I don't think you were on the Zoom when I mentioned that. So we do these virtual, every time we do a wine release, we do a virtual class so we can create the video to create the content that people can access later when they choose to drink the wine. And so this is one of these things that will kind of hopefully live on, and it's part of our story to do a little bit more content building, story building that we make wines with. And I'm honored that you're the first producer that we've done this with. And so thank you so much for your time and passion that you bring to your wines. And by the way, so Craig mentioned earlier the Sketch White and the Vineyard blend, and it's a Sketch White 2018 was a Vineyard Vermentino Moscato Giallo blend that we also worked with Alan on. The Vineyard, that's just kind of an exceptional wine from High Cross Vineyard. There was a 2020 vintage of that, so that's definitely something that's coming in the future here at Vinovium also. And so it's just exciting to be able to continue these programs because every year we get better at what we do, and it's exciting to be able to share those things.